There is a peculiar kind of blindness that does not afflict the eyes, but the mind. It is the blindness of one who, holding a map in his hands, insists on seeing only the paths that confirm the destination he has already chosen. This is the deepest darkness that can consume a man of wealth or a man of poverty equally, for it does not discriminate between the wise and the foolish. It simply waits, patient as death, until each of us, in our moment of greatest certainty, stumbles into the trap we ourselves have constructed with our own unshakable convictions. Confirmation bias is not merely an error of judgment. It is the tapestry woven by human arrogance, where each thread is a selected truth. Each pattern is a self-serving narrative, and the final design is an illusion so convincing that those who contemplate it believe they are looking through a window into reality, when in fact they are merely admiring an ornate mirror of their own hopes and fears. In the realm of finance, where fortunes are built upon foundations of information and destroyed by sandcastles of self-deception, this cognitive bias emerges as the silent assassin, the poison that disguises itself as antidote, the anchor that presents itself as sail. The history of financial markets is stained with the blood of those who could not see beyond their own certainties. From the tulip gardens of 17th century Holland to the digital halls of modern cryptocurrencies, the pattern repeats with the regularity of a condemned clock. Intelligent men and women, armed with education and experience, march confidently toward the abyss, deaf to the warning cries that echo around them, blind to the signs painted in blood red on the walls. Why? Because each carried a map that showed only the path to glory, a map drawn not by reality, but by the desperate hope that this time, this one time, the laws of human nature would not apply to them. But let me tell you a fable, a story about a man who believed he had found the definitive map to eternal wealth, a man whose eyes functioned perfectly, but whose vision was hopelessly corrupted. This is the fable of the blind man and the map, and it begins, like all great tragedies, with a man convinced of his own infallibility. In a port city where the smell of salt and ambition mingled in the foggy air, there lived a merchant named Matthias. He was not the richest of traders, nor the poorest. He occupied that dangerous middle ground where ambition still burns with sufficient intensity to scorch, but resources are still limited enough to make each flame potentially fatal. Matthias had built his modest fortune trading spices from the East Indies, a business that, while profitable, required patience and an intimate understanding of the caprices of sea and markets. But Matthias had grown weary of the slowness of honest enrichment. He watched with corrosive envy the newly wealthy of the city, those who had gambled on speculative ventures and reaped fortunes that eclipsed his in a matter of months. The most notable of these was an investment scheme in a new trade route to the lands of the Orient, a route that, according to its proponents, would cut travel time in half and multiply profits tenfold. When Matthias first heard of this opportunity, something inside him ignited. It was not simply greed, though greed certainly dwelt there. It was something more insidious, the belief that he had been chosen by fate to recognize this opportunity, that his experience in spice trading made him uniquely qualified to assess the merit of this new route. He began to collect information, but here lies the first poison of confirmation bias. Matthias was not seeking truth. He was seeking validation. In the taverns frequented by other investors, Matthias heard stories of success. One man had tripled his investment in 6 months. Another had purchased a mansion with his returns. These stories Matthias absorbed like dry soil absorbs rain, allowing them to saturate every corner of his consciousness. But when an old ship captain, with decades of experience navigating those treacherous waters, warned that the new route crossed seas known for devastating storms and relentless pirates, Matthias looked away. The captain was old, Matthias reasoned. He was stuck in antiquated methods. The world had changed, and those who could not see this were doomed to irrelevance. This is the first stage of confirmation bias in action. The human mind, once it has formed a conclusion, does not behave like a scientist seeking objective truth. It behaves like a lawyer defending a client. Each piece of evidence is examined not for its veracity, but for its usefulness. Information that supports the pre-existing conclusion is accepted uncritically, adorned with exaggerated details, and repeated like sacred mantras. Information that contradicts the conclusion is scrutinized to the point of destruction. dismissed on technicalities, or simply ignored as if it had never existed. Matthias began attending meetings of the investors in the new trade route. In these meetings, held in lavishly decorated halls and bathed in the warm light of expensive chandeliers, he found a sanctuary of confirmation. Everyone there shared his vision. Everyone there had arrived at the same inevitable conclusion. This was the opportunity of the century. When occasional doubts arose, when someone mentioned a concerning report about the nautical viability of the route, the group quickly smothered them under an avalanche of coordinated optimism. They cited experts who supported the venture, though these experts were frequently paid by the very company promoting the route. They pointed to the success of similar ventures in the past, though these comparisons were superficial and ignored critical differences of context. What Matthias did not realize, what he could not realize in his state of confirmatory intoxication, was that he had entered an echo chamber, a chamber where reality was, filtered through multiple layers of collective self-deception, where each voice that echoed only reinforced the narrative everyone had chosen to believe. He believed he was surrounded by allies in the search for truth, when in reality, he was surrounded by accomplices in a crime against reason. Matthias had a younger brother named Thomas, who worked as a scribe for a merchant bank. Thomas had access to financial information that was not widely known. He had seen the records of the company promoting the new trade route, and what he saw alarmed him deeply. The company was severely indebted. Its principal officers had histories of previous bankruptcies. The ships they planned to use were old and poorly maintained. Thomas brought this information to Matthias, presenting detailed documents, urging his brother to reconsider his investment. Matthias looked at the documents. He truly looked, but what he saw was not objective evidence of fraud and incompetence. What he saw was the envy of a younger, less successful brother, trying to sabotage him on the threshold of his greatest achievement. He examined each document not to understand its message, but to find reasons to discard it. This number is outdated. That bankruptcy was due to extraordinary circumstances. These ships will be refurbished before the voyage. For every concern Thomas raised, Matthias constructed a rationalization, a wall of arguments that protected his pre-formed decision from the inconvenient assault of facts. Confirmation bias operates with particular ferocity when there is emotional capital invested in a belief. And Matthias had invested more than emotional capital. He had invested his identity. He had become, in his own mind, the visionary investor, the man who had the courage to see what others could not see, to act where others hesitated. To abandon this belief now would not merely mean losing an investment opportunity. It would mean annihilating the narrative he had constructed about himself, admitting that he was, after all, as common as those he secretly despised. And so, Matthias invested. He did not merely invest his savings, though that would already have been imprudent. He invested everything. He sold his spice warehouse. He mortgaged his house. He borrowed money at usurious rates from loan sharks who would accept no excuses on payment day. He placed every coin he possessed, and many coins he did not possess, on the glittering promise of this new trade route. And when he did this, when he signed the final documents that transferred his fortune into the hands of the scheme's promoters, he felt not fear, but euphoria. The euphoria of the gambler who bets everything on a single roll of the dice, convinced not by probability, but by unshakable faith in his own special destiny. In the months that followed, Matthias became an evangelist. He preached the virtue of his investment to anyone who would listen. When other investors expressed concerns about the lack of news regarding the fleet, Matthias reassured them with confidence. "Long voyages take time," he said. "No news is good news." When rumors began to circulate about financial problems at the company, Matthias denounced them as propaganda from envious competitors. He surrounded himself exclusively with other investors who shared his optimism, deliberately avoiding anyone who might infect him with doubt. This is the second phase of confirmation bias, and it is even more dangerous than the first. In the first phase, the individual merely seeks information that confirms his pre-existing beliefs. In the second phase, the individual becomes a missionary, actively spreading his beliefs to others, not out of altruism, but because each convert serves as yet another confirmation that he is right. Each person he convinces to invest becomes another voice in the choir, singing the song he needs to hear. And with each convert, with each new soul dragged into his shared illusion, reality becomes harder to face, because now it is not just his own pride that is at stake, but his moral responsibility to those he has led down the same dark road. Then came the news. Not gradually, with gentle warnings and opportunities for adjustment, but all at once, like a giant wave breaking over an unsuspecting ship. The fleet had sunk. Not one or two ships, but all of them. The new route, as the old captain had warned, crossed seas that were more than simply dangerous. They were impassable for ships in the deplorable conditions in which the fleet had departed. But there was more. The investigation that followed the disaster revealed that the company had never intended to succeed. It was an elaborate fraud scheme from the beginning. The promoters had already fled with most of the invested capital. The ships that had sunk were merely the disposable carcasses of a plan that had always intended to fail after enough money had been collected. Matthias was ruined, worse than ruined. He was indebted beyond any hope of recovery. His house was seized. His possessions were sold at auction. The loan sharks he had sought in his moment of blind ambition now sought him with demands he had no means to satisfy. But the most devastating thing was not the financial loss. It was the slow and agonizing realization that all the warning signs had been there from the beginning. The old captain had tried to warn him. His brother had brought irrefutable evidence. Countless reports, easily accessible to anyone willing to search honestly, had documented the dangers and irregularities of the company. Matthias had not been deceived. He had chosen blindness. He had held a map that clearly showed the precipices and abysses ahead, but had simply closed his eyes to any feature that did not confirm the path he had already decided to follow. He had mentally redrawn the map, erasing the warnings, adding imaginary golden routes, transforming symbols of danger into promises of triumph. And when others tried to show him the real map, he had pushed them away with anger and contempt, as if they were the blind ones and he the only one who could see. In the twilight years that followed, Matthias became a ghostly figure in the forgotten corners of the port city. He survived performing work he would once have considered beneath his dignity, carrying crates on the docks alongside men who once worked for him. He had become a cautionary tale, though few knew the complete details of his fall. They saw only another failed merchant, another victim of the cruel whims of fate. But Matthias knew the truth. On silent nights, when the day's work ended and he sat alone in his miserable rented room, he finally saw the map as it truly always had been. He saw every opportunity he had had to change course, every voice of reason he had silenced, every piece of evidence he had discarded. The map had not changed. It had always shown the path to ruin. Only his eyes had refused to see it, and that refusal, that voluntary choice of blindness, had been his true tragedy. This is the nature of confirmation bias. It is not a defect of intelligence, but a defect of character. The most intelligent among us are often the most susceptible because they possess the rhetorical tools to construct more elaborate rationalizations, to weave more convincing illusions. A fool can be deceived by lack of information. An intelligent man can deceive himself despite abundance of information. And this second type of deception is infinitely more dangerous because it is self-perpetuating, self-reinforcing, and protected against correction by the very intelligence that should serve as a safeguard. Matthias's final fate is not known with precision. Some say he died poor and forgotten, carrying his belatedly learned lesson to the grave. Others whisper that he eventually left the city, seeking a fresh start in lands where his name and his shame were not known. But his legacy remains, engraved not in stone monuments, but in the invisible pages of human psychology, an eternal testament to the fact that the map we choose to see is often more important than the territory that actually exists. And what of Thomas, the brother who had tried to save Matthias with inconvenient truth? Thomas continued his work at the merchant bank, living a modest but secure life. He never became rich, but he never became poor. He had learned a different lesson from the same story, that there is a kind of wealth that comes not from accumulating fortune, but from avoiding ruin, and that the first step in avoiding ruin is the willingness to see the map as it really is, not as we would wish it to be. Now, let us turn our gaze from the foggy past of this fable to the crystalline reality of the present. Matthias's story is not a curious antiquity, a moral tale from a more superstitious age. It is a mirror, and if you look into it with sufficient honesty, you will see not a merchant from the past century lost in mists of ambition and self-deception, but rather as yourself or someone you know, or someone whose disastrous financial decisions you have witnessed, with the peculiar mixture of pity and relief we feel when tragedy strikes others, but spares us. Confirmation bias did not die with Matthias. It inhabits every trading floor, every board meeting, every bar conversation where investors discuss their positions. It is present when you obsessively check news that supports your investment thesis, while avoiding articles that question it. It is there when you surround yourself with people who think like you about the market, creating an echo chamber where your beliefs are constantly validated but never genuinely tested. It emerges when you interpret ambiguous data in the way that favors your existing positions, when you attribute successes to your own insight, but failures to external factors beyond your control. Consider the modern investor who believes a particular technology stock is undervalued. He will read analysis after analysis that supports this view. He will join online forums where other true believers share his convictions. He will interpret every small upward price movement as validation, every downward movement as market manipulation or collective stupidity of less enlightened investors. When analysts issue downgrades, he dismisses their concerns as outdated or captured by short-selling interests. When the company reports disappointing results, he focuses on the few positive data points buried in the report while ignoring the larger worrying trends. This investor is not stupid. Often he is highly educated, sophisticated in technical and fundamental analysis, articulate in defending his positions, but he is holding a map that shows only the path to success, having mentally erased all routes to failure. And like Matthias, he may eventually discover that the territory of reality does not conform to the map of his hopes. Or consider the investor who believes the market is on the verge of catastrophic collapse. He hoards gold, he converts assets to cash, he reads apocalyptic forecasts, and each one adds another brick to the fortress of his certainty. When the market rises, he interprets this as the final escalation before the inevitable fall. When it occasionally drops, he sees confirmation of his prophecy, even when the market quickly recovers. Years pass, the apocalyptic fall never comes. But he still waits, still believes, still sees in every minor tremor the harbinger of the greater earthquake, because admitting he was wrong would mean confronting the years of lost opportunity and the psychological cost of abandoning an identity he has built around being the only one with vision clear enough to see the coming disaster. Confirmation bias is democratic in its targets. It afflicts bulls and bears equally. It seduces value investors and momentum speculators. It captures believers in market efficiency and proponents of technical analysis. It does not discriminate based on investment philosophy or ideological affiliation. It merely requires one thing: premature certainty. Once you have decided what is true before fully examining the evidence, once you have formed a conclusion and then seek validation instead of testing, you have crossed the threshold into the territory where Matthias made his final journey. And the cost? The cost is not merely measured in lost wealth, though that is substantial. The true cost is measured in irrevocably lost opportunity, in relationships damaged with those who tried to offer alternative perspective, in years spent defending untenable positions instead of adapting to changing reality, and finally, in the slow erosion of the very capacity to think clearly. Because each indulged instance of confirmation, bias makes the next instance easier until the mind becomes not an instrument of discovery, but merely a mechanism for justifying predetermined conclusions. So, what is to be done? How can one escape this trap that has claimed so many victims, that claims new victims with every market cycle? The answer is not simple, because it involves not merely technique, but transformation of character. It involves cultivating the willingness to be wrong, to actively seek information that contradicts your beliefs, to value truth above validation. It involves surrounding yourself not with cheerleaders, but with thoughtful critics, not with yes men, but with skeptics who will force you to defend your positions with honest rigor. It involves keeping a journal of investment decisions and the reasoning behind them, so when you look back, you can see clearly the patterns of your own self-deception, instead of revising them through the convenient fog of selective memory. It involves, above all, intellectual humility, the admission that your map of reality is always, inevitably, an imperfect simplification of a territory that is more complex than any model can capture. The acceptance that absolute certainty in financial matters is not a sign of insight, but of delusion, that those who proclaim to know with certainty what the future will bring are either fools or frauds or both. The wise investor holds his map lightly. He is constantly updating it with new information, erasing routes that have proven to be phantoms, adding hazards he had not previously noticed. He understands that the map is not reality, merely a useful representation of it, and that the usefulness of any representation depends on its correspondence with the actual territory, not on how comfortable or flattering it makes him feel. This is the lesson of the fable of the blind man and the map. It is not that we should avoid making maps. Maps are necessary. Without a model of how the world works, we are completely helpless. But we must avoid falling in love with our own maps. We must resist the temptation to confuse them with the reality they merely represent. And we must always be willing to tear up a map that has proven to be wrong and begin the difficult work of drawing a new one, no matter how much pride we must swallow in the process. True wealth is not built by those who have the most beautiful or most elaborate maps. It is built by those who have the most accurate maps. And accuracy requires the brutal willingness to confront inconvenient truth, to abandon cherished hypotheses when evidence contradicts them, to say I was wrong and recalculate the course while there is still time to avoid the rocks that tear the hulls of overly confident vessels. So ask yourself, as you contemplate your own financial decisions, your own certainties about markets and investments, are you looking at a map or at a mirror? Are you seeking truth or validation? Are you willing to see the territory as it really is, or only as you need it to be, so that your preferred narrative about yourself remains intact? These questions are not comfortable, but they are necessary, because the alternative is to follow Matthias's path, marching toward ruin with eyes wide open, but seeing nothing except the comforting confirmations you have chosen to perceive. If you have found value in this reflection on the nature of self-deception and its devastating cost in financial matters, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. Here at the Financial Fables, we do not offer quick tips or easy formulas for wealth. We offer something rarer and more valuable, the opportunity to confront the uncomfortable truths about human psychology that determine, more than any technical analysis or market insight, whether you will build wealth or destroy it. Each fable is a mirror. What you see reflected depends on your courage to look honestly,